The date was February 4th, 2007, only 3 months after the release of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. One speedrunner by the username MasterLinkX was practicing their movement in the Arbiter's Grounds dungeon when they encountered a strange sequence of events. During their practice, they accidentally drowned in the dungeon's quicksand, but rather than continue, they instead brought up the Wii menu and hit reset. Instead of going back to the game's title screen, MasterLinkX saw Link get up on the Bridge of Eldin, which is nowhere near the Arbiter's Grounds. Link's Master Sword had been replaced with the Orden Sword, and all his other items were gone besides the Orden Sword and Hylian Shield. Eventually, MasterLinkX died in this weird game state, and when they respawned, Epona galloped into the field battle with King Boblin that normally takes place way earlier in the game. Upon completion of the fight, MasterLinkX was taken back to Kakariko Village, only to find that the Elden Twilight which they had cleared hours ago had returned. It was like their game had somehow time-traveled into the past and wiped away their progress. And with that sequence of events, MasterLinkX had accidentally discovered one of the most notable glitches not just in Twilight Princess, but multiple games in the Zelda franchise. A glitch now known as Back in Time. When MasterLinkX reset their game in the Arbiter's Grounds, they actually were sent back to the title screen. But due to the specific frame they reset on during Link's Void Out, the game applied Link's respawn animation to the title screen instead of letting the normal title screen cutscene begin. Once the respawn ended, MasterLinkX could control Link while on the title screen. Of course, it doesn't seem like there'd be much use for this at first glance. All Link has is the Orden Sword, Hylian Shield, and the ability to call Epona, since these are the things he normally has during the title screen cutscene. But there's no other save file progress, so how is this useful in speedruns? Well, Back in Time isn't limited to the Arbiter's Grounds. While it was discovered there, it can actually be performed anywhere that Link can void out and respawn. As luck would have it, it's possible to reach the Orden Bridge only 40 seconds into the game, which gives us a void we can use to perform Back in Time. Despite the fact that Link doesn't have any items yet, performing Back in Time will once again give him the Orden Sword, Hylian Shield, and ability to call Epona. So in this case, he went forward in time, but we still refer to it as Back in Time since the original name stuck. After performing Back in Time, we can save and reload our file to spawn back at the Orden Spring, and using our newly acquired Orden Sword, we can save Talo right away to skip the first 2 days of Orden Village. After hurting some annoying goats, another benefit of Back in Time kicks in and allows us to obtain the Iron Boots from Bo's house significantly earlier than we should be able to. This is due to our ability to call Epona, as the flag which allows us to do this also triggers Bo's text sequence for the Iron Boots. Now, the Iron Boots aren't particularly useful this early, but getting them now skips a few minutes of backtracking that would have to happen later in the run. Following the Iron Boots, runners will also save the game over a different file for later. Back in Time comes back to save more time when runners reach the Forest Temple. This dungeon requires players to save 4 monkeys before they can cross a broken bridge to obtain the Gale Boomerang. But the value that's used to keep track of how many monkeys have been saved is shared by other events in the game, mostly related to bosses, which is why we call this value the boss flag. One of the bosses that uses the boss flag is King Boblin. At the start of Forest Temple, we can save our file and then jump attack into the out-of-bounds void to perform Back in Time again. If we then jump off the Bridge of Eldin, press A to transition to the file selection screen as Link voids out, and select the save file which was created after obtaining the Iron Boots, we can warp into the King Boblin fight and exploit the boss flag. When skipping the cutscene before the King Boblin fight, the game will set the boss flag to a value of 39. This value will quickly tick down and eventually reach 0 once the fight has properly reloaded. However, if we interrupt the ticking down by resetting the game before the fight reloads, the value is going to freeze before it reaches 0. We can then reload our Forest Temple file, play through the short segment of Forest Temple before the Broken Bridge, and as long as our boss flag value is at least 4, the game will spawn in a total of 4 monkeys and allow us to proceed to the Gale Boomerang Room. With all of these uses, Back in Time saves about 10 minutes in the current Twilight Princess Any% route. That's a significant amount of time saved, but it doesn't seem like an amount that would make it one of the most important glitches in 3D Zelda games. And it isn't. Back in Time became an important glitch due to a discovery that glitch hunter MZX Rules made on November 27, 2009, where they demonstrated that Back in Time also works in The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, showing everyone that the glitch wasn't confined to a single game. Just as in Twilight Princess, resetting the game on a specific frame right as Link voids out will cause him to respawn on Outset Island with the title screen logo floating in shortly afterward. This can be done over typical voids or by drowning in water. Unfortunately, Back in Time in The Wind Waker has never panned out to be very useful. Unlike Twilight Princess, Link doesn't have any equipment or items when on the title screen, and there isn't much you can do since you're just back at Outset Island, which is the very beginning of the game. Despite it not being useful, there are some interesting quirks to it that we can look through. With a complicated Back in Time sequence, it's possible to freeze Link's action animations while he moves around, which looks rather humorous. It's also possible to transfer items from regular gameplay to Back in Time, such as heart pieces, small keys, and rupees. And perhaps one of the weirdest quirks is that in Wind Waker, there's actually a second method that you can use to perform Back in Time. In July of 2010, former speedrunner Aruki figured out that if you die and reach the game over screen, you can select continue and then reset your console to activate Back in Time. Contrary to the void out method, the game over method won't place Link back at Outset Island, but will instead place him on the map of his respawn location after the game over, meaning that it's possible to bring the title screen to other maps besides Outset Island. But, like before, Link still doesn't have any items, so there's not much you can do on any map. So, we have Back in Time working in 2 games that both run on a similar engine. And luckily for us, Nintendo decided to make use of that engine one more time. Skyward Sword was released on November 20th, 2011. When the speedrunning community got its hands on the game, the first exploit everybody tried was Back in Time. Although, Back in Time didn't seem to work. Unlike Twilight Princess and The Wind Waker, voiding out in Skyward Sword doesn't cause a map reload. The game simply covers the screen with a circle transition while it repositions Link back to wherever he was last standing, meaning that Back in Time would not be possible using this method. A month later, on December 28th, Skyward Sword runner The Only Zero was practicing the Sandship mini-boss Skirvo. During their practice, they would sometimes die, which meant that they could try the fight again by continuing. Or their shield would break, which they could only get back by resetting and reloading their file. On one attempt, they happened to both lose their shield and die immediately afterwards. After they selected continue on the game over screen, they remembered that to get their shield back, they had to reset. So that's what The Only Zero did. Link then respawned on the title screen, since this is the game over method of Back in Time from The Wind Waker that I described 2 minutes ago. It seems that nobody had tried the game over method up until this accidental discovery, but now that Back in Time was known to work in Skyward Sword, the community began figuring out what was possible. Within only 24 hours, there were 3 major techniques discovered with Back in Time. The first is known as Back in Time saving, or bit saving for short. Because Skyward Sword's title screen takes place on Skyloft, there are some convenient bird statues that can be used for saving. But if you're on the title screen and not on a gameplay file, then what exactly are you saving? The answer is just whichever file was last selected on the file selection. By selecting a file and then saving at a bird statue, you essentially teleport your file back to Skyloft from wherever it was saved. Bit saving can be used to eliminate backtracking and also sequence break the beginning of the game, as this particular state of the Skyloft map has the goddess statue open earlier than normal. It's also possible to create a corrupt file in Back in Time if you begin deleting a file and then save it during the deletion process. The resulting file now has every saved value set to 0. This includes Link's health, so if you load a corrupt file... Corrupt files are useful for dying quickly to activate Back in Time if dying on your current file would otherwise take too long. And the most important find on that first day was a technique known as bit warping, discovered by Zelda glitch hunter Glitches and Stuff. This technique is similar to a bit save, except we perform the actions of saving and starting our file at the same time. This results in the game loading our file on the map it was previously saved on, but with the coordinates of the statue that we saved at during Back in Time. Essentially, a bit warp allows us to teleport Link to the coordinates of a Skyloft statue on almost any map. On its own, bit warping immediately allowed for useful sequence breaks on 6 different maps. With just these techniques, Skyward Sword already had more uses for Back in Time than Twilight Princess or The Wind Waker. The key difference is that in Skyward Sword, the title screen transitions to the file selection menu without a map reload. This allows us to stay in Back in Time while selecting files in Skyward Sword, whereas the other 2 games will end Back in Time by loading a different map for their file selection menus. The discoveries in Skyward Sword didn't stop after the first day, though. Some community members began to notice that selecting files during Back in Time would sometimes cause weird things to happen, such as random cutscenes beginning to play or objects on the map changing their state. Although it wasn't quite clear what was causing this to happen when it was first discovered, so it became known as bit magic. The community eventually realized that certain events in each game area would line up with triggering certain events on the Skyloft map. For example, having the Skyview Temple open, saving in the Faron Woods, and then selecting that file in Back in Time would trigger the Thunderhead opening cutscene. Similarly, having this log push down in Faron Woods would open up the Upper Academy gates. These interactions are due to these pairs of events each having the same relative scene flag value within their respective scenes. In other words, pushing down this log is scene flag 27 in Faron Woods, and the Upper Academy gates being open is scene flag 27 on Skyloft. So when selecting your Faron Woods file during Back in Time, Skyloft reads that scene flag 27 is set and will open up the gates accordingly. One very significant use of bit magic came in the form of early Thunderhead. On April 13th, 2012, a rookie figured out that by starting a file and then triggering the cutscene of the Thunderhead opening up as the game faded out would cause the Thunderhead to be open on that file. This could be done way before normally opening up the Thunderhead, and thus it resulted in a 20-minute time save. Another key bit magic discovery came in 2015, where a group of various runners figured out that bonking into this tree in Faron Woods and then selecting that file in Back in Time would spawn in the Life Tree seedling item at Skyloft's pumpkin patch. You could then dig up the seedling and start your file as you cleared the seedling text to put the seedling on your file and save another 2.5 minutes. After early Life Tree seedling, things got quiet for a few years on the Back in Time front. Even with the 50 or so minutes that Back in Time saved in Skyward Sword as a whole, the game's any percent speedrun was still 5 hours long, and much of the motivation for researching Back in Time had dried up over the past few years. But as it later turned out, there was still one more powerful technique waiting to be found. On May 5th, 2019, I was doing some Back in Time research for a video I planned on making. To help my research, I was making use of a newly released tool called the Dolphin Memory Engine, which easily allowed me to view memory changes happening in real time as I was playing the game. During my research, I noticed that when making scene flag changes in Back in Time, those changes would always persist until I selected a different file. So I thought, hold on, if these scene flag changes persist while the same file is selected, then can I transfer them to the file by just starting it? The answer was no, as starting a file would revert the file's scene flags back to what they were supposed to be. But I noticed that this would happen immediately after pressing start, and not after the fade-out transition occurred. So my next question was, can I try making a scene flag change during the fade-out of starting a file? The answer was yes. If you start a file during Back in Time and then apply a scene flag change, the scene flag you set will be applied to the map you're saved at instead of the Skyloft map. For instance, if you start a file saved at Eldin Volcano and then push the gravestone that opens up the Skyloft Shed at night, which is scene flag 47, you set scene flag 47 in Eldin Volcano instead, which corresponds to the Earth Temple door being open and skips collecting the 5 key pieces normally needed to get in. This action of pushing scene flags from Back in Time onto a save file is sort of the opposite of bit magic, which was loading in scene flag values from our save file into Back in Time. So this new technique was coined as reverse bit magic. Once we realized the power of this technique, the entire next week was spent documenting scene flags in every area of the game to see how they lined up with the scene flags on Skyloft. And boy, there were a lot. Meeting Betro the Demon lined up with the Temple of Time statue activation, talking to Professor Allen in the Academy lined up with opening the Lanayru Silent Realm, giving Betro 5 Gratitude Crystals lined up with opening the Eldin Silent Realm, collecting the Loftwing Prison Gratitude Crystal lined up with having found the Sandship, and so many more were discovered. And the most important scene flag in the entire game, scene flag 62 in the Sealed Grounds, which opens up the door to Hylia's realm and could save 75 minutes on its own, lined up with nothing. There is no interaction on Skyloft that sets scene flag 62. Skyloft just doesn't use it, which means that we can't use reverse bit magic on Skyloft to open the door to Hylia's realm. But there's an important part to that last statement. On Skyloft. On May 31st, 2019, I figured out a relatively complicated file setup using the Eldin Light Pillar that allowed us to finally get the Back in Time state off of Skyloft and into the Faron region of the Overworld. Once there, we could access the Faron Woods and Lake Floria maps, which meant that we could now perform reverse bit magic with their scene flags as well. And in the Faron Woods, scene flag 62 corresponds to opening the Lake Floria door. And with that, Back in Time and all its uses now saved over 3 hours in Skyward Sword. Over the course of the next year and a half, Skyward Sword was continually whittled down thanks to other new discoveries and realizations involving Back in Time and reverse bit magic. The current any% record sits at around 1 hour and 22 minutes, meaning that Back in Time currently saves around 4.5 hours in Skyward Sword as a whole. Skyward Sword is thus far the last 3D Zelda game that has Back in Time. The newer entries in the series don't have the same reset capabilities that made it possible in the older titles, and so it seems that Back in Time may always be limited to these 3 games. Still, Back in Time is a complicated and diverse glitch across the games where it works, and even if we've come a long way with Back in Time, we're likely to run into a few more surprises as we move forward in time to understand it further. I'm Gymnast86 with Lowest Percent, and thank you for watching.